Good morning, everyone. It's, it's wonderful to see so many faces, old friends and new friends. And it's great that we're able to take this time to really focus on our spiritual life. I want to explain just briefly because these talks will also go out over the internet. And I just want to let people who are watching over the internet know a little context. Um, this is Inner Renewal Week, and it's primarily focused on the spiritual life here at Ananda Village. So it's a way for us who, during the summer especially, and other times that we have larger classes, we're so busy serving a lot of guests that we don't have the time to go inward. And so during the slower time of the year, uh, during this time of the year specifically, we do this Inner Renewal Week. Last year we called it Winter Renewal Week, which we had for years in the past. And calling it Winter Renewal Week, winter renewed itself and we ended up getting a lot of snow. So this year we've changed the title. Doesn't take us more than 20 years to catch on. So we've changed the title to Inner Renewal Week, and there are longer meditations, classes every morning, and spiritual activities in the evenings. I want to just give a little brief overview of the classes that we will have in the mornings. This morning, Davy and I are going to talk about how to embrace the search for God. This topic comes from the new vows in the Nayaswami order, the first of which is a very, very powerful statement. It says, "From now on, I embrace as the only purpose of life the search for God." And so how do we embrace that purpose, the only purpose of life, which is the search for God? That's this morning's topic. Tomorrow we'll talk about what draws us toward God and what pulls us away from God, because we all experience those two tendencies, those two movements of energy in ourselves. On Wednesday morning, we're going to talk specifically about the pilgrim vows of the new Nayaswami, the new renunciate order, the Nayaswami order, because on Thursday night we will have an initiation. So we'll take those vows and go into them in more depth, and then we'll also on that morning talk about Swami's 14 points of what comprises true renunciation. And so talking about the vows and those points, we're going to call that class a roadmap to self-realization. And then on Thursday there will be a panel that will talk about how to live with God. So that's the flow of the classes. On Friday there won't be a class because there's a Kriya initiation in the evening and we want to have it more inward. And then on Saturday there will be a Kriya panel to talk about Kriya. So that's the flow of the week. But especially during this week, what we should all do is try to tune in more and more deeply with the spiritual search that we're all on. This is I think this is my favorite class series of the year as a speaker, because so often as a speaker, you have to try to tune into, always as a speaker, you have to try to tune in to the consciousness of the audience. But when the consciousness of the audience the spectrum is too great, some very new beginners on the spiritual path, and then people who've been on the path for 35 or 40 years, you have to kind of play a little bit of mental ping pong, bouncing back and forth between those two audiences. This group is a much more uniform, homogeneous group, because virtually all of us have been on the path for a very long time. if we added it up, the number of years of on the path, there are probably 140, 50 people in the room and 20 years, 3,000, 4,000 years of experience on the spiritual path. So being able to address that level of dedication is in some ways more fulfilling and easier. So buckle up. So this morning we're going to talk about how to embrace the search for God. And that embracing of the search for God is an extremely central and important part of this spiritual path. Without that, we can't make very much progress. It'll be slow. It'll, a little bit of effort. Well, the way Patanjali puts it in the Yoga Sutras, he talks about how quickly one makes progress. He says, for the extremely energetic and dedicated, progress is rapid. For those of moderate dedication, the progress is moderate. And for those who give it little energy, the progress is slow. And so it's common sense. We know that from all kinds of other models in our life. But the more extreme our dedication becomes, the faster our progress becomes. But there are also tendencies in us that hold us back from that progress. And so those tendencies that hold us back, we're going to address more tomorrow, but we always have a little bit of a mixture in our consciousness of the downward pull, the pull toward worldliness, and that which holds us back from spiritual progress. And then we have the pull upward toward God, toward union with God. And that embracing of the upward flowing energy, or the positive flowing energy toward God, is the essence of what we need to do in order to find a quick path to God. Master described the consciousness that we live in. First of all, he said that thoughts are things. They aren't just amorphous. They aren't just, subtle things that come and pass and don't have much power. Thoughts are things, and they do have power. They do have magnetism. Just as gravity holds the world together, it's quite amazing the parallels between the physical universe, the way God has created it, and the spiritual universe. You all remember that story happened pretty early in Swami's life, where Master asked him one day, he'd been with Master maybe a few months, and Master asked him one day, why doesn't the Earth fly out into space? And Swami kind of puzzled. He'd studied astronomy a little bit, wanted to be an astronomer as a young boy, so I guess he thought, well, Master's tuning into that, and he wants a little explanation of basic astronomy. And he said, well, you see, it's the gravity, the pull of the sun that's pulling the Earth toward it, and therefore it doesn't fly out into space. Master said, oh, well then why doesn't it just get drawn right into the sun? And Swami kind of, well, I guess he still needs more explanation. And so he said, well, it's the centripetal force of its movement that's moving it, and pushing that pull is pulling it out away, and those two are in balance, and that's why the orbit is there. Master said, oh, thank you very much. And it was some time later, a few weeks or a few months later, when Swami thought he wasn't asking me about astronomy. He was giving me an analogy of our position with God. God magnetically is drawing us to him, just as the sun, with its gravitational force, is drawing the planet into into it. But our movement, and it's such a beautiful example, the restless movement of our consciousness trying to reach out, and those two find a kind of a balance, and that describes the orbit of the planet Earth around the sun. But it also, that same analogy describes our position, our orbit around God. For those who have begun to lose the momentum, and we're going to talk about that. How do we lose the sense of momentum that wants to draw us away from God? And as that momentum begins to diminish, then the orbit comes in closer and closer, closer and closer, until finally the planet is unified with the sun. And that's the process that we're working on. So one of the things that we're working on is how to, when we say how to embrace the search for God, there are these two forces. We're trying to increase the magnetism, and I'm going to talk specifically about that, to increase the magnetism, because it's a two-way magnetism. The earth and the sun is a partially good example, but it doesn't have the same level of consciousness involved. For us, there's the magnetic pull of God, and that our response to that is increased by our consciousness, whereas the earth can't will itself to lose momentum. It's just governed by the laws of physics. We can, by our consciousness, by our will, and by the attunement of our will, we can increase our part of the magnetic formula, so that you've got God pulling us and us increasing the magnetism, and those two will make more rapid progress. So our part is to increase the desire for God, the momentum toward God, and the part that we can play in it is to work on tuning in, especially to God and Guru. The Guru for us becomes the model, the example. And so by tuning in with our heart and our minds more and more to the Guru, we become more and more magnetically attracted. I want to read something from the Gita. It's one of those quotes that it's good to kind of memorize, because I want to read the quote and then reverse the quote. This is from the second chapter in the Gita, verses 62 and 63. Dwelling mentally on sense objects breeds attachment to them. It's also, in some translations, translated as gazing upon the object of desire breeds attachment to it. So putting your mind toward the object, here the sense object, breeds attachment. I don't want to talk too much about this, but I want to touch on it. That's why Master said that if you're trying to overcome some negative attraction, as soon as the thought comes into the mind, push it away. Substitute something else. Think of do some activity, but stop the thought early on, because that's when it has the least momentum. It's like a train just beginning to start up. You can put a wedge under its wheels and stop it right there. Once that train gains momentum, it's very, very difficult to stop. So if you're trying to stop a thought pattern, as soon as it comes into the mind, stop it right then and there. So dwelling mentally on sense objects breeds attachment to them. From attachment arises craving. From craving, when frustrated, springs anger. Anger produces delusion. Delusion causes forgetfulness of the self, loss of memory as to what one is in truth, causes decay of the power of discrimination. From loss of discrimination ensues the annihilation of all right understanding. So that's how we get into delusion. That's how that outward momentum gets going. And it all starts by the mental direction of our thoughts and our desires toward sense objects. And that's why Master, when he said thoughts are things, things, in this case, thoughts carry power, thoughts carry magnetism. And the more powerful, the more focused that magnetism is, that energy is, the more the magnetism is produced. But let's reverse this, or change it just slightly. What happens when dwelling mentally on God breeds attachment to Him? From attachment arises craving. From craving, when frustrated, springs anger. We'll substitute disinclination for the opposite. From disinclination produces delusion. Well, delusion in this case, the disinclination means that we're no longer wanting we're no longer drawn into that world. Delusion causes forgetfulness. If you do sense objects, forgetfulness of the greater self. If you put your attention toward God, it's the forgetfulness of the self, but of the little self. See how that changes everything depending on the direction of energy that the flow is going. Loss of memory as to what one is in truth is followed from the loss of forgetfulness of the self. But if you're forgetting the little self, then you don't lose the memory of what you are in truth. You lose the memory of what you are in Maya. And you begin to no longer think of yourself as being a creature of Maya. One of the further vows in the Nayaswami vow is, I no longer exist as a separate entity, but offer my life unreservedly into thy great ocean of awareness. And so the loss of the little self means that you no longer even think of yourself as that little self. And that whole paradigm of the outward flow begins to disappear, and eventually that outward momentum no longer carries you away, and the attractive power of God pulls you into Him until union takes place. But our part of this is that we have to open ourselves, because everything is consciousness. Ultimately, everything is consciousness. But especially in this attractive force between us as we are now, as we perceive ourselves to be now, not as we are, as we perceive ourselves to be, that sense of separateness, we have to start from there as our starting point. And so how do we, as a separate being, or thinking of ourselves as a separate being, how do we begin to change the way that we think about ourselves? Well, again here, gazing on objects of the senses, or dwelling on objects of the senses, produces craving. Dwelling on God produces a craving for God. And that's the first and great principle of the spiritual path, is that we need, in whatever way we can, to turn our hearts and our minds more and more toward God. It's just, in one sense, it's habit, because if we establish a new habit of thinking about God, thinking about Guru, including God and Guru in our daily activities, then that habit produces energy. The law of magnetism goes like this. We've all heard the first part. The greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. That means, in this case, we're talking about thinking about God. The more flow of energy, the more willingness to think about God, the more those thoughts flow toward God, it produces energy. The greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. The greater the flow of energy, the greater the magnetism. Now, this law of magnetism is universal. It isn't just that which draws us toward God. If we think about sense objects, more magnetism goes toward being drawn to the world. If we think about God, more magnetism gets drawn toward God. But I don't want to talk just about thought, because thought is actually the second thing that happens. It's more the heart's energy. Thought follows desire. And so we have to work to increase our desire for God. And there are many, many aspects of how we can accomplish that. The first and most important thing is that in our meditation, we need to still our minds so that they begin to dwell on God. Now, there's another very important aspect of this. See, it's only the ego that doesn't want to think about God. Our true self, the soul, that's all it does. That's all it does, is not think about God, but dwell in God. So our essence is always connected with God, because that is who we are. That is what everything in the world is. Think of it this way, that a few hundred years ago, before we were beginning to get out of Kali Yuga, all people could see was the outer form of things. That's the delusion of Kali Yuga, is that everything is the form that it assumes. So all they could see was the form of things, and all of those forms outwardly seem different. It's self-obvious that they're different. But then, as we move into Dwapara Yuga, we begin to see and understand the universal consciousness of the world begins to perceive that outward appearance isn't really the only thing going on. And so first there's the invention of microscopes, so that you can see that the outer form is made up of littler forms. And then gradually you get more and more able to perceive smaller and smaller forms, until finally, toward the end of the 19th century, you begin to understand that things are made up, everything is made up of atoms. And so as you get out of the outer form and into the atomic structure, everything is made up of atoms. Everything is the same. And the atoms are made up of subatomic particles. And now we're, as a whole human race, we're working on the question of what are those subatomic particles? They're just restarting up in Switzerland. They built a huge particle accelerator. It's a tunnel underneath the Earth, 17 miles around. And that whole tunnel is lined with huge, powerful, superconducting magnets. And they're going to get two streams of charged particles, one moving this direction, one moving this direction, and they move those faster and faster and faster until they're very close to the speed of light, and then they smash them together. And that explosion of those, it's an enormous amount of energy. In that one micro millisecond, there's more energy than is used probably by the whole country of Switzerland. But it's only there for that very brief period. But that amount of energy breaks apart the subatomic structure, and they're looking for especially one particle, subatomic particle, that they know theoretically has to exist, but they have never been able to find. And that's what gives an atom mass, or we think of it as weight, but what produces weight in an atom? And so that's what they're looking for. But the whole of modern physics, so they spend, I don't know, $100 billion trying to find something called the Higgs boson. I mean, I don't know where they get the names, but at any rate, there's this, think of mankind as, the energy is reaching out, trying to understand the universe scientifically. But the yogis told us what's there centuries ago, millenniums ago. They said, well, yes, there's atomic structure. They talked about that. Subatomic structure, they talked about that. But behind that is energy. And modern physics is now talking about, well, it looks suspiciously like there's no such thing as matter, as solid matter. There's only energy winking in and out of existence. And that winking in and out of existence very quickly, like frames on a movie picture, producing the appearance of a movie there, appearance of solid reality. That winking in and out of existence seems to be what's going on. Well, the yogi said, well, that's true. But what's the next step then? What's beyond energy? Beyond energy is consciousness. And the consciousness producing the energy, producing the physical appearance of reality, is what creation is made up of. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get back to that level of consciousness. So what we have to do is keep energizing and solidifying and making stronger and stronger the understanding of how powerful our thought is, how powerful our consciousness is. Because if it's our consciousness, if it's consciousness that produces the world, it follows that it's your consciousness that produces your world. Change your consciousness, you change your world. Move your consciousness from dwelling on sense objects to dwelling on God, and you change your world from Maya to one of self-realization. When the consciousness is shifted completely so that all your consciousness is thinking about God, then there's nothing left except God. But it takes that focus of consciousness, and you have to have concentration and energy behind that concentration to break through. When Einstein was thinking, we all know that he came up with the laws of relativity and understood, the E equals mc squared and so on. But energy equals the mass times the square of the speed of light. Why? Why should that be anything? Well, Einstein was obsessed. I mean, all he could think about, he would wander around and he would look at the universe and he would look at trees and he'd look at light bouncing off the leaves. And he was obsessed with light for 10 years, at least 10 years before he came up. And, he'd be sitting there in a cafe with his friends and they'd be talking away and he'd be gazing off. He'd be thinking about light. And so his mind just, as Master said, if I didn't have a job, I would churn the ether until it gave me a job. Said that during the Depression. If I didn't understand light, I would churn the ether until it gave me the explanation of light. So Einstein was dwelling on this and dwelling on this and dwelling on this. And why should it be that light seems to always be the same speed? Whether if you If you're moving, if a train is moving toward you, the sound is higher, and as it moves away, the pitch is lower. And sound seems to have different speeds, but light seems to be a constant. Whether it's moving toward you or away from you, it's always the same speed. How can that be? And he dwelled on that and dwelled on that. All of a sudden, he had this great insight that it isn't the speed of light that changes, it's time that changes. And that's what gave him the understanding of the theory of relativity, that time is the shifting thing, not the speed of light. There's one constant. Master actually talks about this in the autobiography, in the Law of Miracles. The one constant in the universe is God's consciousness, and everything else shifts around that. But it isn't apparent on the surface, so we have to keep dwelling on God and Guru. One of the practices that I have had recently, well, I'll tell a little story first, because it's important that we understand the basis of reality of this. We have a member in the community, Irene Schulman, whose mother is a very saintly person, grew up in a monastery and was going to be a nun, but came to this country and then ended up, through circumstances, marrying and having several children, but still has this deep, deep spiritual nature. Speaks Spanish. She's from Mexico. One time, 10, 12 years ago, I can't remember exactly, she was here visiting Irene, and she went out for a walk, and Irene was expecting her back, and she didn't come home. Finally, she came home a couple of hours later, and she was kind of in a stunned state, and Irene was very concerned that I think she must have had a stroke or something. And she said, "Let me call a doctor." And Ophelia said, "No doctor, no doctor." That's all she could say. So after about an hour, she was able to kind of come out of that state. And as it turned out, when she was walking, she had a vision of Master. And Master spoke to her in Spanish or beyond Spanish. At any rate, they had a conversation, just talking. She asked questions about her children and some aspects like that. And finally, toward the end, she said, "Do you visit here often?" He said, "Oh, I'm always here." Now, either she is in delusion or we are in delusion. Either Master is always here and we aren't perceiving him, or she had some hallucinatory thing. I kind of prefer that Master's always here. I don't know about you guys, but anyway, I'm going to take that as a reality. So if Master's always here, why aren't we perceiving him all the time? It's because that outward momentum, the mind is attached to sense objects. Sense objects creates a craving for them. That outward going momentum keeps the mind pushed too far outward, because as it said in the autobiography, remember the time when Sri Yukteswar came to visit Lahiri Mahashaya and Babaji was there? Well, I'll tell the story a little more deeply. Babaji had come to visit Sri Yukteswar in Dakshineshwar. And there's a big tree by a bathing ghat there. And Babaji and a few disciples were under that tree. And Sri Yukteswar said, "Oh, let me go and get you sweetmeats." He wanted to honor him. And so he went and got sweetmeats and he brought them back. And Babaji was gone. And Sri Yukteswar was a little bit hurt by that. You know, he wanted to honor Babaji, and he went there, and then Babaji was gone. Well, later Babaji said, "Your restlessness fair blew me out of the ether." So in that instant, Sri Yukteswar was too restless. And so later on, he came and visited Lahiri, and Lahiri said, "Don't you see Babaji?" And Sri Yukteswar said, "No." And he said, "Oh, well, your restlessness, your mind isn't calm enough yet. He's hiding behind the sunbeams." Well, Master's here, hiding behind the sunbeams. So if we treat as a reality the fact that Master is here all of the time, not that he's far away, not that he's somewhere else, but he's here as ubiquitously as the sunbeams, then by concentrating on that, by accepting that, Master said about the law of attraction, he said, "Believe and it will be so." The law of attraction, the thoughts that you put power into, manifest. He said, in order to manifest a vision in meditation, if you want to see Master in meditation, visualize him and hold your visualization long enough and strong enough, and that will actually produce a true manifestation of him. It's that we haven't yet trained ourselves to do that long enough and deeply enough. So we're starting out. We're working on it. At least we're working on how to do this. And as we do that more and more deeply, so in meditation, visualize Master. During the day, try to connect with Master as being behind the sunbeams. Or doesn't have to be Master, but whatever form of God you hold dear in your heart. I've taken to the practice of trying to, it's somewhere between a visualization and a daydream. Trying to think through my day ahead and think through it with Master beside me and accompanying me. So this morning I was visualizing, getting ready. Master was there, coming to class. Master's here, giving a talk. Master, I was visualizing him sitting over there. He is over there, just he's over there in his subtle form. And so visualizing him there during lunch, during the meditation before lunch, and so on, all the way through the day. So it was, as I say, somewhere between a daydream and a visualization. I like the term that Haridas used for it. He's on the pre-prayment plan. So he pre-prays for what he wants. So think through your day. And as it gets farther and farther out, at least for me, it gets a little vaguer. So you have to keep renewing that and renewing that. So when you're about to do something, try to visualize or think of Master as being present there. As you dwell upon God, you create a craving for God. And so more and more, let your mind dwell upon, gaze upon Master. And that heart energy going toward him produces, the mind follows the heart. So the heart energy going toward God and Guru produces thoughts in the mind, because consciousness is universally created, not individually created. So really what you're doing is the heart is the tuning dial of your consciousness. You're tuning that dial through your heart's desires into craving and then attachment and finally into the loss of the little self. And that process of doing that is what allows us to embrace as the only purpose of life the search for God. I want to end by saying one more very, very important aspect of our path which produces this. Remember, I began with the outward momentum of the earth and why it doesn't fly off into space. That outward flowing energy is also present in our consciousness, in our spine, in the physiology. It isn't just thoughts or things. It isn't just vague, unmanifested kind of hocus pocus. But in fact, there's a flow of energy up and down in the spine. And at each of the chakras, that energy goes out toward the world. So the energy comes down the spine, and at each of the chakras it goes out and connects us to the world. That flow of energy is what it means on a deeper level of dwelling on sense objects. The energy is dwelling on the sense objects. It's dwelling on the world. And that creates a craving for the world. Craving creates attachment, and so on. So if that flowing energy going out toward the world is what creates attachment to the world, how do we create attachment to God with this particular thing? Well, it's self-evident. We reverse the flow of the energy from going out to going in. What are our techniques about? Every one of them is about reversing that flow of energy from going out to now coming in, and then from the downward flow into the upward flow. So our techniques are meant to reverse the flow of energy which is down and out in the worldly person, or I love the word samsari, he who is attached to the world, the samsari. So the samsari's energy is down and out. If you want to be down and out, that's the way to do it. If you want to be a yogi, it's in and up. And so the techniques that we have, Hong Sa, energization, Om, and most especially Kriya, are all designed specifically to reverse that flow, bring the energy back into the spine, and bring it up. And so, coming back again to Patanjali, moderate effort produces moderate results. Weak effort produces weak results. Strenuous effort produces quick results. So concentrate more deeply on Hong Sa, Om, and Kriya especially. Not with effort, but with joy. Swami in 1979 did a whole tour around the country that we called the Joy Tour. And he went around and gave classes on joy is the solution. It is not the reward. Finally, after a dozen classes or so, he began to change the topic because people were too distracted. They couldn't understand joy. They couldn't understand the fact that if you live in a state of joy, that's the solution to the problem. It isn't that if you solve the problem, then you get as a reward the state of joy. Solution is the state of joy. Joy is effortless. Joy just is our basic nature. It's everything else that creates effort. It's restlessness that creates effort. So dwell in the sense of joy more and more. Meditate with joy. End your meditations with joy. Walk, talk, act with Master hiding behind the sunbeams. And Master carries with him the continuous state of joy. Connect more and more deeply with that, and you'll have no choice but to embrace the search for God.